The night was thick with the scent of salt and the subtle chill of an approaching storm. Waves crashed against the hull of the ship with relentless insistence, each impact sending a shiver through the timbers and into the bones of the sailors on deck. Lanterns swung wildly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the deck, as if the ship itself were caught between reality and some otherworldly dream. Above, the moon hid behind heavy clouds, leaving only fleeting glimpses of pale light that glinted off the restless water. Somewhere in the distance, a low, haunting melody seemed to rise from the depths, delicate yet eerie, threading its way through the roar of the ocean. It was a song that no human voice could match, sweet and sorrowful, carrying a promise that was impossible to resist. The sailors tightened their grips on the ropes, their eyes straining to pierce the darkness. Some whispered prayers, others muttered curses, but all felt the same unease, a subtle shift in the air, a presence just beyond the edge of perception. For centuries, tales had circulated among seafaring communities of creatures that were neither fully human nor entirely fish, beings who walked the line between reality and myth. They were called mermaids, and their legend had haunted sailors since the dawn of exploration. On nights like this, when the ocean seemed alive and breathing, the stories felt less like myth and more like an ominous truth lurking just beneath the waves. The creak of the ship's timbers was accompanied by an occasional splash, as though something brushed against the hull and vanished before it could be seen. The men on deck shared uneasy glances, their minds wandering back to tales passed down in taverns and ports, of sailors lured to doom by a shimmering figure with hair like molten gold, eyes as deep as the ocean, and a song that promised everything yet delivered despair. Even the most skeptical among them felt the icy fingers of dread crawling up their spines, for the ocean, with its uncharted depths and hidden currents, had a way of making men question everything they thought they knew. As the ship rocked violently with the rising waves, a faint glow appeared beneath the surface, an unnatural luminescence that pulsed and shimmered like living fire. It was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but then it grew brighter, forming shapes that were both human and impossible. The sailors froze, some gripping the railing, some crossing themselves in silent hope for protection. The glow undulated with the rhythm of the water, and from its depths came that haunting melody again, soft yet impossible to ignore. The air seemed charged, electric, as if the sea itself had decided to speak. Some men pressed their faces to the deck, unwilling to look, yet unable to resist. The line between fear and fascination blurred with each passing moment, making time stretch and warp as they listened to something older than any of them, something eternal and unknowable. Stories of the sea had always contained a warning: respect its power, or face its wrath. But legends also carried fascination, the irresistible allure of the unknown. And tonight, with the wind whipping around them and the waves heaving beneath, the sailors understood that allure more than ever. Each crash of water against the hull was a reminder that nature could be merciless, and each note of that otherworldly song a whisper that the line between myth and reality might be thinner than anyone dared imagine. For in the age of exploration, when maps were still incomplete and the world's oceans held secrets beyond comprehension, a legend could be as deadly as a storm, and a melody as dangerous as a jagged reef. One sailor, the youngest on board, swore he saw a glimpse of something emerging from the depths, a figure that shimmered in silver and green, moving with a grace that no human could mimic. He blinked, and it vanished, leaving only ripples and the faint trace of a melody lingering in the wind. His heart raced, and though he knew he would likely be laughed at later, in that moment, he could not shake the certainty that he had encountered something beyond human understanding. Around him, others shared similar visions, fleeting yet unforgettable, each shaping the night into a tapestry of fear and wonder. The storm began to intensify, lightning illuminating the clouds in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder rolled across the horizon like the roar of a colossal beast. Yet even as the sailors braced against the elements, the haunting melody persisted, winding around their hearts and minds. Some swore it carried promises of fortune and love, others felt only despair and doom. It was a song that mirrored the duality of the ocean itself, beautiful, mesmerizing, but endlessly dangerous. The contrast between terror and awe made the night feel eternal, each second stretching into a heartbeat of suspense. In the quiet moments between lightning and wave, the men could almost hear whispers of long-gone sailors, voices carried by the wind, warning them of the depths and the creatures that might dwell there. Tales of mermaids were always intertwined with tragedy, ships lost without a trace, entire crews vanishing, survivors returning with haunted eyes and trembling voices. The line between legend and lived experience was impossible to define, and perhaps that was precisely the point. The ocean demanded respect, and it rewarded curiosity with both wonder and peril. By dawn, the storm began to ease, leaving behind a calm, silver-gray sea that reflected the rising sun. Yet the memory of the night remained, etched in the minds of every sailor on deck. That brief encounter, real or imagined, had awakened something primal, the understanding that the ocean was alive with mysteries that humans could not hope to fully comprehend. And somewhere beneath that endless expanse of water, the whispers continued, promising that the legend of the mermaid, half human, half fish, entirely enigmatic, would endure, shaping the fears and dreams of those who dared to sail into the unknown. For anyone listening now, drifting into sleep, imagine the wind in your hair, the cold spray of the sea on your face, and the haunting melody echoing just beyond perception. Feel the tension, the awe, the subtle fear that has accompanied sailors for centuries. And know that even as the waves calm, the whispers of the sea continue, timeless, mysterious, and unforgettable, waiting for the next curious soul to listen closely enough to hear the call of the mermaid. Long before sailors first set out into the vast, uncharted oceans, human imagination was already entwined with the mysteries of the sea. In the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, priests and storytellers spoke of beings that moved effortlessly between water and air, creatures that could charm, trick, and sometimes destroy those who crossed their paths. These earliest legends were not mere entertainment, they were a reflection of humanity's awe and fear, a symbolic attempt to understand forces that could provide life through fish and water, yet also take it away through storms and floods. The mermaid, half human and half fish, became a perfect embodiment of this duality, alluring and dangerous, familiar yet entirely other. In the temples of ancient Babylon, priests carved images of hybrid beings onto clay tablets, their faces serene, their tails curling beneath them as though they were one with the currents. Fishermen whispered about glimpses of strange figures in the shallows, sometimes glimpsed in the glimmer of dawn or reflected in still lagoon waters. These accounts, though fragmentary, reveal an early fascination with creatures that were neither wholly divine nor fully mortal. They were liminal, existing between realms, much like the sea itself, which could be calm and nourishing one day, and fierce and destructive the next. In these early myths, the mermaid was both a warning and a guide, a reminder that life depended on respecting the mysteries beyond human control. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, Greek culture gave the legend a poetic and philosophical dimension. Sea nymphs, or nereids, were depicted in literature as ethereal and enchanting, their beauty rivaling that of the gods themselves. Homer's epic spoke of sirens, whose songs were irresistible yet fatal, luring sailors to rocks and death. The Greeks' fascination was not merely with physical appearance, it was with power, temptation, and knowledge that existed outside human reach. To encounter such a being was to confront both desire and fear simultaneously. It was an early exploration of the psychological complexity that would follow the mermaid myth through the ages. In the northern reaches of Europe, Norse sagas carried similar stories, but with a darker, harsher tone. The cold waters of the North Sea and the fjords were unforgiving, and the legends reflected that harshness. Mermaids, or mummen, were said to appear during storms, their faces pale and haunting, singing songs that could freeze the blood and warp the mind. Sailors feared these creatures not only for their beauty but for their apparent power over life and death, for to see one was often a prelude to tragedy. These narratives captured the raw tension between man and nature, emphasizing that survival depended not only on skill but also on humility and respect for forces beyond human understanding. Across Asia, different interpretations emerged, but the essence of the mermaid endured. Japanese ninjyo, for instance, were creatures with fish bodies and human faces, sometimes benevolent, sometimes ominous. Consuming their flesh was believed to grant longevity, yet catching one could bring storms and misfortune. In West African coastal communities, water spirits often combined human and aquatic traits, acting as protectors or punishers depending on human behavior. Even in these culturally distinct contexts, the same thread ran through the myths. Water-dwelling hybrids symbolized a profound connection between humans and the unpredictable natural world. Trade routes, exploration, and migration allowed these myths to intermingle, evolve, and gain layers of complexity. Sailors from different lands exchanged stories in crowded ports, over flickering fires, and in the quiet moments of a long voyage. One merchant might describe a luminous creature glimpsed at dawn, while another would recount how his uncle's ship sank after a haunting melody floated across the waves. These stories grew richer, their details more vivid, and their warnings more urgent. Over time, the mermaid legend became a universal language of the sea, a symbol both of beauty and danger, desire and fear, hope and despair. What is remarkable about these early accounts is the way they reflect human psychology as much as the natural world. The oceans were vast, and much of the world remained unexplored. Humans could not know what lay beneath the surface, and imagination filled the void. The mermaid emerged as an archetype, representing curiosity, temptation, and mortality all at once. Sailors spoke of seeing human-like figures that vanished before being touched, hearing songs that seemed almost to whisper their names. They wrote these accounts in journals, passing them down to the next generation, blurring the line between eyewitness testimony and collective imagination. The physical descriptions varied, yet the essence remained consistent. Mermaids were beautiful yet terrifying, seductive yet dangerous. Sometimes they had golden hair that shimmered like the sun on calm waves, other times their eyes glowed like moonlight reflected on water. Their tales were described as iridescent, powerful enough to sweep men into the depths, yet delicate enough to mirror the gentle sway of the ocean's currents. These details created a haunting visual in the minds of listeners, blending reality and fantasy so thoroughly that the legend could almost be believed. Beyond appearance, the mermaid's behavior was a reflection of human hopes and fears. They were protectors of hidden treasures, keepers of forbidden knowledge, or omens of destruction. Sailors interpreted every sighting differently. Some saw mercy, others calamity, and many wondered if their own fates had been subtly influenced by forces beyond comprehension. In this way, the mermaid myth became a mirror of human psychology, revealing desires, anxieties, and the deep fascination with what could not be explained. Over centuries, the stories traveled from port to port, evolving yet retaining their essence. By the Middle Ages, mermaids had entered European folklore in full force, appearing in illuminated manuscripts, paintings, and the oral traditions of coastal villages. They were no longer simply mysterious beings. They became symbols in cautionary tales, moral stories, and maritime superstition. Sailors were advised to avoid tempting waters, to resist alluring songs, and to respect the balance of nature, lessons disguised as legend, yet carrying the weight of truth. Even today, the origins of the mermaid myth speak to a timeless human impulse, to seek meaning in the unknown, to reconcile fear with fascination, and to imagine creatures that inhabit the thresholds of possibility. The legends remind us that stories can endure, shaping perception and culture long after the events that inspired them are forgotten. They are living echoes of human imagination, carried across centuries like whispers on the ocean wind, captivating hearts and minds, and bridging the gap between the real and the impossible. As you drift deeper into thought, imagine the first sailors peering into the shimmering dawn, catching glimpses of strange, graceful forms beneath the water. Picture their wonder, their terror, and their curiosity as the mermaid myth was born, not from a single moment, but from centuries of human experience and imagination. Each tale, each observation, each frightened whisper became a thread in a tapestry that stretches across continents and ages. And with every retelling, the legend grew, drawing us closer to the enigmatic creatures that haunt our collective memory, reminding us that the sea has secrets we may never fully understand. The early days of seafaring were filled with wonder, danger, and uncertainty. Sailors navigated vast oceans with nothing but the stars above and the endless horizon ahead, their vessels creaking under the strain of waves that could rise like mountains without warning. For these men, the sea was both a provider and a predator, a source of sustenance through fish and trade, yet a force capable of swallowing ships whole in a single night. It was during these perilous voyages that the first whispers of mermaids gained traction, born from fleeting glimpses and unsettling encounters that defied explanation. In the journals of medieval mariners, there are repeated mentions of strange figures glimpsed in the water. Sometimes these were seen at dawn, when the light caught the shimmer of scales beneath gentle ripples. Other times, they appeared at twilight, their forms outlined against the fading sun, moving with a grace that no human could mimic. Sailors often described the figures as beautiful, ethereal, with eyes that seemed to hold the knowledge of the deep. Yet the beauty was always tinged with danger, for these creatures were said to sing haunting songs that could lure even the most steadfast navigator toward hidden rocks, treacherous reefs, or the crushing embrace of the waves. One chronicler wrote of a ship caught near the rocky coasts of northern Europe, where the crew reported seeing a creature rise from the water and gaze at them with a piercing, almost human intelligence. The men were paralyzed with both fear and fascination, unable to turn their eyes away from the figure's haunting gaze. Days later, the same ship ran aground, though no storm had been forecast, leading the sailors to believe that the encounter had been a warning, or perhaps a curse. Such accounts, repeated across generations, blurred the line between myth and lived experience, creating a pattern of stories that seemed to validate the mermaid's presence in the human imagination. Not all encounters were visual. Many sailors spoke of hearing voices or songs carried across the water, melodies so delicate and sorrowful that they could not be ignored. Some claimed to recognize the song as calling their own names, as if the creature beneath the waves knew them intimately. The psychological effect of isolation at sea, combined with exhaustion and the constant threat of danger, made these experiences all the more vivid. It is easy to imagine how men, adrift on vast, featureless waters, could mistake the wind, the echo of waves, or the movement of schools of fish for something supernatural. And yet, these sensations were compelling enough to enter the permanent lore of maritime culture. In coastal villages, these tales were passed from one generation to the next, growing in detail and intensity. Parents warned their children to respect the sea, sailors warned each other to remain vigilant, and stories of vanished crews were told beside firelight, with every listener imagining the glimmer of a tale beneath the waves. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the ocean was deepest or the waters most dangerous, tales of mermaids seemed to thrive. They became both cautionary and explanatory, helping communities to rationalize the inexplicable while keeping the supernatural sense of the sea alive. Some early encounters were recorded with meticulous detail. One 15th-century account described a ship approaching a narrow strait when a figure emerged from the surf, singing a song that caused the men to lose their footing and nearly fall overboard. The chronicler noted the shimmer of scales, the glint of eyes, and the unearthly quality of the melody. Although some dismissed these reports as exaggeration or superstition, others took them seriously, recording every detail in logs and letters, insisting that something beyond human understanding had truly been observed. The consistency of such accounts across centuries and regions lent weight to the legends, even if the evidence was never tangible. The line between fear and fascination was never clearer than in these early encounters. Sailors often admitted to a contradictory mixture of desire and dread, drawn to the beauty and mystery of these beings while simultaneously terrified of the danger they represented. Some tales describe men attempting to reach out to the figures, only to have them vanish like mist, leaving behind a lingering sense of longing and unease. These encounters reinforced the idea that mermaids were not simply creatures of legend but forces of nature themselves, unpredictable, untouchable, and entirely beyond human control. Even when mermaids were not directly observed, sailors spoke of their presence in more subtle ways. Unusual tides, sudden fogs, or inexplicable shifts in currents were sometimes attributed to these enigmatic beings. Ships that sank without apparent cause or were found drifting empty were sometimes explained as the work of mermaids taking vengeance or guiding humans toward doom. The uncertainty of the open ocean created fertile ground for imagination, and each new story reinforced the belief that the mermaid was both real and potent, a reminder that humans were never fully masters of the waters they traversed. The psychology of these encounters cannot be understated. Isolation, fatigue, and constant vigilance can heighten perception, making ordinary phenomena appear extraordinary. Yet the accounts were remarkably consistent across time and culture, suggesting that sailors perceived something that transcended mere hallucination. Whether through glimpses of shapes beneath the waves, the sound of a haunting melody, or a sudden chill that swept across the deck, these early encounters shaped a shared maritime consciousness, one that balanced wonder, fear, and respect for the ocean's vast, unknowable depths. It was also a time when oral storytelling held immense power. Sailors returning to port would recount their experiences in taverns and marketplaces, embellishing the tale for dramatic effect. Listeners, captivated by the descriptions, passed the stories to their own communities, often adding their own details. Over time, the encounters became legendary, forming a tapestry of narrative that transcended individual experience and became collective memory. This communal storytelling ensured that the mermaid myth remained alive and potent, shaping the perception of the sea long after any single voyage had ended. By the time exploration expanded into the New World, these early encounters had already established a framework for understanding mermaids as both alluring and perilous. The sea was no longer merely a physical challenge, it was a psychological and cultural one as well. Sailors approached every unknown coast with a mixture of caution, awe, and superstition, knowing that the line between reality and legend could blur at any moment. Each sighting, each song carried across the water, added another layer to a myth that would endure for centuries, influencing art, literature, and the very way humans perceived the mysterious, watery world beyond their sight. The early maritime encounters were, in essence, the foundation of the legend that would later terrify entire crews and inspire centuries of storytelling. They remind us that human perception is intertwined with imagination, that fear and fascination can coexist, and that the ocean, vast, deep, and unpredictable, has always been a stage for both real and imagined mysteries. For those listening now, imagine the deck of a ship at night, the wind tugging at your cloak, the distant shimmer of something moving beneath the waves. Feel the simultaneous pull of curiosity and dread, the magnetic allure of the unknown, and understand why, for early sailors, mermaids were never just a story. They were an ever-present possibility, a whisper from the depths that could change a life or end one. The ocean, vast and untamed, has always been a realm where reality and legend intertwine, where the boundaries between natural phenomena and supernatural imagination blur beneath the endless horizon. For sailors of the past, the sea was as treacherous as it was mesmerizing, and its perils were often amplified by stories passed down through generations. Storms could rise without warning, currents could drag ships into hidden reefs, and mist could obscure dangerous coastlines. Amid these physical threats, the legends of mermaids lent the ocean an additional layer of mystery, a presence that seemed to guide, warn, or punish depending on one's fortune or misfortune. Historical records from medieval ports are filled with accounts of sailors who believed they had glimpsed mermaids just before disaster struck. One chronicle recounts a small merchant vessel approaching a rocky coastline under calm skies. The crew saw a shimmering figure rise from the water, singing softly, its voice almost indistinguishable from the wind. Moments later, a hidden shoal tore into the hull, and the ship was left listing dangerously. To the men aboard, the appearance of the mermaid could not be mere coincidence. It was a portent, a warning carried on the ethereal notes of a melody that seemed designed to lure or test human perception. Navigating dangerous waters required skill, courage, and a touch of superstition. Sailors knew that unseen hazards, jagged rocks, whirlpools, sudden storms, could claim lives in an instant. Yet the mind, attuned to survival, often sought patterns, seeking explanations that could make sense of random or uncontrollable events. The mermaid, hovering between myth and reality, offered such an explanation. A sudden squall, a shipwreck, or an inexplicable disappearance could all be attributed to the influence of a creature from the deep, a tangible manifestation of the ocean's unpredictability. The human mind craved narrative even in chaos, and mermaids filled that need beautifully, blending danger with fascination. Some of the most compelling stories came from the North Atlantic, where treacherous waters were both feared and respected. Ships navigating the fjords and inlets of Scandinavia often reported sightings of pale, haunting figures rising from icy depths. One account tells of a vessel caught in a sudden fog bank, its crew disoriented and anxious. In the distance, a figure appeared, its hair flowing like seaweed, its eyes reflecting an impossible depth. The men claimed they heard a song, barely audible yet unforgettable, pulling them toward rocks that lurked beneath the water's surface. The fog lifted, the figure vanished, and the ship was miraculously spared. Yet the sailors returned to port forever changed, their respect for the sea deepened and their belief in mermaids strengthened. Even in tropical waters, where the sea seemed calm and inviting, legends held sway. Sailors in the Caribbean and Indian Ocean spoke of mermaids appearing during storms, their glowing forms visible through sheets of rain and the flicker of lightning. Ships that foundered on coral reefs or vanished mysteriously were sometimes credited to these creatures, reinforcing the notion that the sea itself could harbor agents of fate. These stories created a sense of cautious awe, blending practical knowledge of hazards with the enigmatic allure of the unknown. The result was a maritime culture that was at once empirical and imaginative, grounded in survival yet suspended in wonder. What is particularly fascinating is how consistent these accounts were across time and geography. Despite differences in culture, climate, and language, sailors reported similar experiences: glimpses of beautiful, human-like figures with fish-like tails, the sudden appearance of shapes beneath the waves, and the haunting sound of a voice or song carried on the wind. Even skeptics could not entirely dismiss the pattern. It became clear that, whether through optical illusion, psychological phenomena, or rare natural occurrences, something in the ocean's depths consistently evoked the image of a mermaid, compelling human perception to interpret it as both danger and delight. The ocean's unpredictability amplified the sense of threat. Hidden currents could sweep an entire crew off course, while sudden storms could transform a calm voyage into a battle for survival. Mariners learned to respect the subtle signs of nature: the smell of rain, the direction of clouds, the behavior of seabirds, but the legends added an invisible dimension to this vigilance. A mermaid sighting was not merely a story, it became a lens through which to interpret real danger. If a figure was glimpsed before disaster, it was considered an omen. If a strange melody was heard, it might be a warning or a curse. This interplay between legend and lived experience created a rich, immersive environment for sailors, blending fear, anticipation, and awe. Consider the accounts from the Mediterranean during the Renaissance. Trade routes were bustling, yet many voyages ended in sudden, inexplicable misfortune. Ships would vanish, only to be found days later with hulls damaged or men missing, and eyewitnesses often claimed to have seen mermaids or other sea creatures at the time of the disaster. Even when rational explanations, such as reefs, storms, or navigational errors, were likely, the legend of the mermaid provided a narrative framework, helping humans comprehend the incomprehensible. It is a testament to the enduring power of storytelling that these myths could coexist with empirical observation, each reinforcing the other in a delicate balance between imagination and reality. The psychological dimension is equally compelling. Long voyages in isolated conditions left sailors highly sensitive to suggestion, to the sounds and movements of the natural world. Fatigue, fear, and loneliness could make a glimpse of shimmering scales or a fleeting shadow feel profoundly significant. Add to this the oral tradition of sailors' tales, each story enriched and dramatized over years, and it is easy to understand how early encounters were magnified into legend. These encounters were neither entirely hallucination nor fully tangible, they existed in a liminal space where the mind and the sea coalesced into myth. In many cases, mermaids were associated with specific geographic features: sharp rocks, hidden reefs, or unpredictable currents. Sailors learned to interpret these features with both scientific knowledge and mythic imagination. The presence of a mermaid became a narrative explanation for hazards that could not always be charted or predicted. In this way, legend and reality reinforced each other, forming a sophisticated maritime consciousness that combined observation, superstition, and caution. A sailor who respected the legend might avoid dangerous waters, increasing his chances of survival. Thus, myth served a practical purpose, guiding behavior in a perilous environment while captivating the imagination. Even today, remnants of these beliefs persist in cultural memory. Coastal villages remember the stories of mermaids and other sea creatures, recounting them with reverence and awe. Shipwrecks still inspire speculation, and the mysterious rhythms of the sea continue to evoke both fear and wonder. The early encounters of sailors with mermaids, whether based on fleeting glimpses, optical illusions, or the mind's response to isolation, have left an indelible mark on human culture. They remind us that the ocean has always been more than a physical environment. It is a space of imagination, storytelling, and the eternal dance between danger and beauty. As you imagine the scene, picture a ship sliding over dark waters, the wind tugging at sails, the spray of the sea on your face, and a distant shimmer just beneath the waves. Hear the haunting melody, faint yet insistent, and feel the delicate tension between reality and legend. These dangerous waters, both literal and psychological, shaped the lives of sailors and gave rise to stories that have endured for centuries. The ocean, in its infinite complexity, remains a place where myth and reality collide, where mermaids may or may not wait just beyond the horizon, and where every journey carries the echo of countless tales of wonder and peril. The ocean is not merely a physical space, it is a theater for the mind, a stage where perception and imagination merge in ways that can both enchant and terrify. Sailors, adrift for weeks or months on open water, experienced a heightened sensitivity to sound, sight, and touch. In the isolation of the sea, even the faintest whisper could carry enormous weight. Among the most compelling and enduring elements of the mermaid legend was the siren's song, a melody said to weave itself into the hearts and minds of those who heard it, promising beauty, love, and unimaginable allure, yet often foreshadowing disaster. The siren's song is a fascinating intersection of myth, psychology, and human vulnerability. Early accounts describe the song as almost impossibly delicate, a voice that seemed carried on the wind itself, faint yet unforgettable. Some sailors claimed they could hear their own names being called, or phrases that resonated with personal longing and desire. The effect was magnetic, drawing men to the edge of reason, tugging at curiosity and fear simultaneously. In many ways, the siren's song functioned as a mirror, reflecting the deepest desires and anxieties of those who heard it. Isolation and sensory deprivation amplified the perception, making ordinary noises, the hiss of waves, the creak of rigging, or the rustle of wind, transform into an otherworldly melody. Modern psychology provides insight into why these experiences were so potent. Prolonged exposure to isolation, fatigue, and the constant threat of danger can heighten suggestibility and create vivid auditory and visual hallucinations. The brain, seeking patterns and meaning, can construct coherent perceptions from fragmented stimuli. A lone sailor, exhausted and tense, might interpret the sound of the wind rushing through rigging or the echo of a distant wave as a song with human qualities. The mind, primed by centuries of oral storytelling, would naturally fill in the details. A voice, a song, a figure beneath the waves. What begins as a natural stimulus becomes a rich, immersive experience, reinforcing belief in mermaids and their enchanting songs. Yet the power of the siren's song extends beyond hallucination. It symbolizes the profound allure of the unknown, that pull toward curiosity, desire, and risk that defines human exploration. The song's duality is central to the legend. It is simultaneously seductive and dangerous, drawing sailors toward peril even as it fascinates them. This tension mirrors the sea itself, a realm of beauty and bounty but also of lethal unpredictability. The myth of the siren's song is, in essence, a narrative encapsulation of human vulnerability in the face of forces beyond comprehension. Historical accounts are rich with examples of this phenomenon. One 16th-century log describes a ship navigating treacherous waters near the Scandinavian coast. The crew heard faint, melodic notes, rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. Some men became entranced, following the sound to the edges of the deck, their minds almost hypnotized by the music. Others attempted to warn them, shouting over the wind, but the voices of those under the spell were lost to the sea. Moments later, a sudden wave struck, nearly capsizing the vessel. To this day, historians debate whether the event was the product of extreme fatigue and suggestion or whether some extraordinary force played a role. Either way, the story demonstrates the profound psychological impact attributed to the siren's song. Interestingly, the descriptions of the song are remarkably consistent across regions and centuries. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the tropical waters of the Indian Ocean, sailors reported melodies that were ethereal, sorrowful, and irresistibly alluring. This consistency suggests that while hallucination and suggestion played roles, the legend itself created a framework for interpreting ambiguous sensory input. The mind expects a song, and it often perceives one, reinforcing the myth in a self-sustaining cycle. The more the story is told, the more likely subsequent listeners are to experience it in ways that match the established narrative. The psychological power of music itself cannot be ignored. Music can evoke deep emotion, alter perception of time, and even influence motor control. The notion of a song capable of compelling a sailor toward danger is a poetic exaggeration of real neurological and emotional responses. Sound carries over water with unusual clarity, especially in calm, open seas, and isolated sailors, already in heightened states of awareness, would have been particularly susceptible to the auditory illusion. Coupled with centuries of storytelling, the natural acoustics of the ocean became a stage for psychological and mythic experience alike. The siren song also speaks to universal human themes: longing, temptation, and the allure of the unknown. Sailors often reported that the song seemed to promise love, companionship, or revelation, yet always remained just out of reach. The phenomenon is metaphorical as much as it is literal. It represents the tension between desire and danger, curiosity and caution. Humans are drawn toward beauty and mystery, even when it threatens survival. The Mermaid's song captures this tension perfectly, becoming a narrative embodiment of both the sea's enchantment and its peril. Beyond the individual experience, the legend of the siren song served as a social and cultural mechanism. Tales of hypnotized sailors were cautionary stories, warning new recruits to remain vigilant, avoid temptation, and respect the unpredictability of the ocean. In a pre-scientific age, these narratives were practical as well as entertaining. They reinforced norms of behavior, provided explanations for accidents, and preserved collective wisdom about the hazards of long voyages. The psychological resonance of the siren song made it an especially powerful teaching tool, embedding lessons in emotion and imagination rather than mere instruction. Sailors' diaries often highlight the interplay between fear and fascination. Those under the influence of the siren song reported conflicting emotions: dread, longing, curiosity, and awe, all simultaneously. The experience could be intoxicating, almost addictive, drawing attention away from practical concerns even as the mind sensed imminent danger. This duality mirrors the broader human experience of encountering the unknown, a mixture of terror and wonder, anxiety and excitement. In this way, the siren song is more than a myth, it is a psychological mirror, reflecting the ways humans respond to environments that are beyond full comprehension. Even today, the notion of the siren song continues to captivate the imagination. Stories, art, and literature explore the idea of irresistible allure, danger, and mystery, linking contemporary psychology with centuries-old legend. For listeners drifting toward sleep, imagining the sound of the sea carrying a soft, mournful melody evokes the same subtle tension and fascination that haunted early mariners. The legend persists not merely because of hallucination or superstition, but because it encapsulates a universal truth: humans are endlessly drawn to beauty and mystery even when it carries risk. To envision the scene fully, picture yourself on the deck of a ship at night. The air is thick with mist, waves rock the vessel gently yet persistently, and the faintest sound floats across the water. It is a melody that is simultaneously beautiful and unsettling, intimate yet distant. You are compelled to listen, to move closer, yet you sense the danger inherent in following it too far. This is the essence of the siren song, a perfect blending of reality, perception, and myth, of human vulnerability and the profound mystery of the sea. As the melody fades with the rising wind and changing tides, the memory lingers, leaving a subtle, hypnotic imprint on the mind. It is a reminder that the sea is not just a physical space, but a psychological and cultural landscape, where imagination and perception shape experience. The siren song, in its haunting beauty, represents the interplay of mind and myth, fear and fascination, desire and caution. And in that space, the legend of the mermaid continues to live, guiding, warning, and mesmerizing all who venture too close to the unknown. Throughout maritime history, shipwrecks were not only tragedies of loss but also fertile ground for storytelling, superstition, and myth-making. Every splintered mast that washed ashore, every sailor who failed to return, every vessel that vanished into the fog became woven into narratives that blurred fact with imagination. Among the countless stories, the presence of mermaids was often cited as either an omen of disaster or a direct cause of catastrophe. The siren's song and the shimmer of a tail breaking the surface were not merely embellishments. They became the very symbols by which communities understood the ocean's capricious nature. One of the earliest recorded examples comes from the 12th century, when chroniclers in England described the wreck of a merchant ship near the eastern coast. Survivors swore they had seen a figure in the waves before the storm struck, a woman with flowing hair and gleaming scales, whose eyes glowed as if reflecting lightning itself. The storm arrived without warning, and within hours the ship was in pieces. Though the official record attributed the disaster to sudden weather, local fishermen retold the tale differently. They believed the mermaid had summoned the storm, her appearance serving as both warning and curse. In their telling, the shipwreck was not simply a matter of wind and tide but of supernatural retribution for daring to challenge the sea. A century later, Norse sagas mention a vessel lost off the coast of Iceland. Sailors reported spotting a marmen, a mermaid-like creature of the north, swimming parallel to the ship before vanishing beneath the waves. Shortly afterward, the vessel struck hidden rocks and was torn apart. The survivors believed the sighting was no coincidence, interpreting it as a sign that fate itself had turned against them. Stories like these were retold endlessly in coastal villages, not just as warnings but as shared experiences that bonded communities to the mysteries of the ocean. Each retelling deepened the conviction that mermaids were intimately tied to the destiny of ships. During the Age of Exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, as European powers pushed further into uncharted waters, sightings of mermaids multiplied. Explorers returned not only with spices, gold, and exotic goods but also with tales of strange beings glimpsed on distant coasts. Christopher Columbus himself, during his first voyage to the Americas in 1493, wrote of seeing 3 mermaids rise from the sea. He noted they were not as beautiful as they are painted, but he was nonetheless convinced he had witnessed them. Historians suggest he may have seen manatees or dugongs, but for Columbus and his men, the sight aligned perfectly with centuries of maritime lore. The oceans were vast and strange, and to encounter mermaids was to confirm that old legends had roots in reality. Not all sightings ended in disaster, but many did. In 1608, off the coast of Newfoundland, English explorer Henry Hudson recorded in his journal that 2 of his crew had seen a mermaid. They described her as having long black hair, a white skin, and a tail like that of a porpoise. The very next day, Hudson's ship was battered by storms, and several men perished. The correlation between sighting and tragedy only deepened the belief that mermaids were harbingers of doom. For sailors already living at the edge of survival, every unexplained event took on supernatural significance. The wreckage of a ship was not merely evidence of poor navigation or bad weather, it was part of a cosmic story in which mermaids played a central role. In the warmer waters of the Caribbean, the association between shipwrecks and mermaids became particularly vivid. The 17th century saw countless European ships dash against reefs, undone by storms, currents, and unfamiliar geography. Survivors often told of haunting melodies carried on the wind or shimmering figures glimpsed just before disaster struck. Some claimed the mermaids were vengeful, dragging ships to destruction as punishment for trespassing. Others believed they were mournful beings, warning of inevitable doom but powerless to prevent it. Either way, the mermaid became inseparable from the shipwrecks that littered the Caribbean coastlines. In port towns, taverns echoed with stories of ships lost to sirens, the wreckage a grim testament to the sea's power. Famous wrecks gave rise to enduring legends. One Spanish galleon, the Nuestra Señora de Atocha, sank in 1622 during a hurricane near the Florida Keys. Survivors whispered that the ship had been haunted by sightings of mermaids days before the storm. Though official accounts blamed the weather, the rumor persisted for generations that the sea spirits had foreseen, or perhaps caused, the disaster. When treasure hunters later searched for the galleon centuries afterward, they too encountered tales of mermaids guarding the ocean floor, as if the legend had become fused with the wreck itself. The 18th and 19th centuries, often considered the height of the golden age of sailing, also produced some of the most detailed accounts of mermaid sightings. Whalers in the North Atlantic frequently claimed to see strange forms among the waves. One whaling log describes a sailor climbing the rigging to look out for whales, only to spot a woman's face emerging from the foam. He shouted to the crew, but when others looked, only waves remained. Days later, the ship struck ice, leaving several men stranded. Such stories circulated not only as entertainment but also as explanations, framing random misfortunes within a narrative of supernatural causation. The wreck of the Mary Celeste in 1872, discovered abandoned yet intact, her crew vanished without explanation, gave rise to speculation that mermaids or sea spirits had lured the sailors away. Though modern historians attribute the mystery to more practical causes such as water contamination or mutiny, folklore seized upon the idea that unseen voices, perhaps the siren's call, had compelled the crew to leave their vessel behind. Even in the rational age of the 19th century, mermaids remained a compelling explanation for the inexplicable. What makes these stories so enduring is their psychological resonance. For the sailors who lived them, shipwrecks were not isolated accidents but part of a larger, mysterious relationship between humankind and the ocean. Mermaids symbolized the unpredictability of that relationship, a force that could never be controlled or fully understood. Their presence in the narrative of shipwrecks was not merely decorative but essential. They embodied the awe, fear, and reverence sailors felt for the sea. The tradition of linking mermaids to shipwrecks also served a cultural function. For coastal communities, these stories explained tragedy in human terms. The ocean was vast and impersonal, but by attributing disaster to the will or warning of mermaids, people could make sense of loss. It was easier to believe a shipwreck had a cause, even a supernatural one, than to accept it as meaningless chaos. In this way, mermaid legends offered comfort as much as fear, transforming grief into narrative and mystery into meaning. Even today, shipwrecks and mermaid sightings remain intertwined in popular imagination. Divers exploring sunken vessels sometimes speak of eerie sensations, of feeling watched or hearing faint sounds carried through the water. These modern echoes of ancient belief show that the legend is not confined to the past. The ocean still inspires stories, and mermaids continue to haunt the places where human ambition collides with the sea's indomitable power. The mermaid legend is not the property of any single culture, nor is it confined to one coastline or one sea. Like the currents that weave through the oceans, the myth has traveled across continents, reshaping itself in the imagination of every people it touched. From Europe to Africa, from Asia to the Pacific Islands, stories of half-human, half-aquatic beings appear with remarkable consistency, yet each carries a distinct cultural flavor. These variations reveal not only the universality of the ocean's mystery but also the diverse ways humans have sought to interpret their relationship with the waters that surround them. In Europe, the mermaid is often remembered as beautiful but dangerous, an emblem of temptation that warns against hubris. Medieval bestiaries, illuminated manuscripts filled with symbolic depictions of animals both real and mythical, frequently portrayed mermaids holding mirrors and combs, symbols of vanity and seduction. To European storytellers, the mermaid embodied the peril of desire unchecked, the way a fleeting attraction could lead to downfall. This interpretation grew naturally out of the cultural values of the time, where religious morality shaped perceptions of the body, beauty, and temptation. The European mermaid was less a benevolent spirit of the sea than a cautionary figure, teaching lessons about humility and self-restraint. By contrast, in West African traditions, the mermaid myth took on a more complex and sometimes benevolent role. In the Yoruba faith, the water spirit known as Memiwata is often depicted as part woman, part fish, or surrounded by aquatic imagery. Memiwata is both feared and revered, embodying wealth, fertility, and spiritual insight but also capable of wrath when disrespected. For coastal communities, she represented the ocean's dual power to provide abundance or to take life. Fishermen and traders offered her sacrifices, hoping for safe voyages and prosperous returns. In this way, the mermaid-like figure was not a mere seductress but a goddess-like force, integral to cultural rituals and daily survival. Farther east, in India, stories of apsaras, celestial beings often associated with water, echoed mermaid-like qualities. Though not always depicted with tails, they were aquatic dancers and singers, beings of beauty and allure who interacted with gods and humans alike. In Hindu epics, these water spirits were sometimes agents of distraction, sent to test sages or warriors, yet they could also bring blessings. Once again, we see the same duality, water beings as sources of both peril and grace, temptation and transcendence. The cultural interpretation varied, but the symbolic core remained intact. In Japan, the ninjyo presents another fascinating variation. Unlike the Western mermaid, the ninjyo was often described as having a fish's body and a human face, sometimes grotesque rather than alluring. To catch one was considered a bad omen, bringing storms or misfortune, yet stories tell of eating its flesh granting extraordinary longevity. The ninjyo embodied paradox, danger intertwined with immortality, horror alongside blessing. Japanese tales often carried moral undertones, emphasizing respect for nature's creatures and the consequences of human greed. This version of the mermaid was not a temptress but a moral teacher, reflecting values deeply rooted in harmony with the natural world. Among the Inuit peoples of the Arctic, legends spoke of Sedna, a sea goddess who was once human. Betrayed and cast into the ocean, her fingers transformed into the sea's creatures, seals, whales, and fish. Sedna ruled beneath the waves, controlling the bounty of the hunt. When hunters disrespected her, she withheld food, causing famine. When appeased through ritual, she provided abundance. Though not a mermaid in the conventional sense, Sedna reflects the same archetype, a powerful being bridging human and aquatic worlds, embodying both mercy and vengeance. Her story highlights the intimacy of coastal cultures with the sea, reminding listeners that survival depended on reverence for forces beyond their control. In the Pacific Islands, particularly among Polynesian cultures, water spirits often appeared as shapeshifters, moving between human and fish forms. They were guardians of lagoons, reefs, and sacred waters. Unlike the predatory sirens of Europe, these beings were sometimes protective, warning humans of storms or guiding canoes through treacherous currents. The myths reflect the central role of the ocean in Polynesian life, where navigation, fishing, and seafaring were woven into identity. For these communities, mermaid-like beings symbolized connection, guidance, and respect for the deep waters upon which they depended. What unites these diverse myths is not the physical description of the beings but the symbolic role they play. In every culture, water creatures embody liminality, the state of being between worlds. They are not fully human, yet not fully fish. They live in the threshold between land and sea, known and unknown. This in-between nature mirrors humanity's relationship with the ocean itself. We depend on it, yet we cannot fully inhabit it. We marvel at its beauty, yet we fear its depths. The mermaid archetype captures this contradiction across geography and history. The cultural variations also demonstrate how myths evolve to reflect local needs. For Europeans, whose religious framework emphasized morality, mermaids symbolized temptation and sin. For West Africans, living in societies tied to the ocean for survival, mermaid figures were deities of fertility, wealth, and destiny. For the Japanese, in a land shaped by respect for balance, the ninjyo carried lessons of consequence. Each version is uniquely suited to its cultural context, yet all share the same underlying fascination with beings that blur the boundary between humanity and the sea. When sailors traveled along trade routes, these myths did not remain confined. Stories of memi-water mixed with European tales of sirens, while Japanese ninjyo accounts fascinated Western scholars and collectors. The mermaid became a global figure, constantly reshaping itself as stories flowed across borders. By the 19th century, illustrated books and popular theatre portrayed mermaids not only as folkloric beings but as symbols of universal wonder, bridging cultures through shared imagination. To imagine the full picture, consider standing at a shoreline in any part of the world centuries ago. Whether you were a European fisherman, an African trader, a Japanese sailor, or a Polynesian navigator, you would hear stories of figures in the sea. Some warned you of temptation, others asked for reverence, still others promised blessings or longevity. Despite differences, all whispered the same truth. The sea is vast, mysterious, and alive with forces beyond comprehension. The mermaid, in all her cultural forms, is humanity's way of giving that mystery a face. As these cultural variations intertwine, they form a tapestry richer than any single myth. They reveal not only the power of the ocean but also the creativity of human imagination in confronting what cannot be explained. The mermaid, whether beautiful or grotesque, benevolent or dangerous, is a reflection of us, our fears, our desires, our longing for connection with the unknown. And across the centuries, as ships sailed, storms raged, and songs drifted across the waves, this legend continued to thrive, reshaped but never lost, as timeless as the sea itself. As mermaid legends spread through cultures, they were rarely left untouched by religion. In every age, faith traditions sought to explain the ocean's mysteries and assign moral weight to the creatures said to inhabit it. The mermaid was never just a being of the sea, she became a canvas upon which societies painted their deepest values, fears, and lessons about sin, virtue, and the eternal struggle between the sacred and the profane. In medieval Europe, where Christianity shaped daily life, mermaids were often depicted as cautionary figures. Church texts and illuminated manuscripts portrayed them as embodiments of temptation, holding combs and mirrors as symbols of vanity and lust. To gaze upon a mermaid, much like to listen to a siren song, was to risk being drawn away from spiritual purity into the dangers of desire. Sermons warned congregations of the mermaid's beauty, using her as an allegory for sin that appeared attractive but concealed destruction. Much like the forbidden fruit in Eden, the mermaid promised delight but led only to downfall. In this way, folklore was woven into theology, reinforcing moral lessons that shaped medieval imagination. But mermaids were not always painted solely as villains. In some Christian tales, they carried echoes of redemption. A mermaid who repented, who longed to be more human than beast, became a symbol of the soul yearning for salvation. This duality, destruction on one hand, redemption on the other, reflected a central truth of religious teaching, that even the most fallen beings could seek grace. Thus, the mermaid could serve both as a warning against lust and pride, and as a symbol of hope for transformation. Beyond Europe, in African traditions influenced by both indigenous faith and later Christian interaction, water spirits like Memi-Wata took on a more complex, sacred identity. She was associated with fertility, wealth, and destiny, yet her power was not to be taken lightly. Religious rituals were performed to honor her, asking for blessings of abundance or safe passage across the sea. Failing to respect her was seen as not only disrespect to nature but also a violation of the divine order. In this context, the mermaid figure was less about temptation and more about balance, teaching that spiritual harmony required offerings, humility, and acknowledgement of forces greater than oneself. In Japan, the ninjyo carried its own moral lessons, rooted in Shinto and Buddhist thought. To catch a ninjyo was a warning, a disruption of natural order that could bring misfortune. Yet to consume its flesh, in the rare stories where this occurred, was to touch the divine, gaining miraculous longevity. Here, the lesson was one of reverence, respect the beings of the sea, or face consequences. But also, understand that the boundary between the sacred and the mundane is delicate, treat it with care. This moral thread echoes throughout Japanese folklore, the balance of action and consequence, the need to live in harmony with the natural and spiritual world. Religious symbolism often framed mermaids as intermediaries, beings that stood between worlds, just as faith itself often bridges the mortal and divine. They lived where land met sea, where human life could not survive, yet where human imagination reached. This liminality made them powerful allegories. They represented the dangers of straying too far into forbidden realms, but also the potential for revelation. Theologians in the Middle Ages sometimes even debated whether such beings, if they existed, would have souls, a question that reflected broader anxieties about salvation and divine justice. The moral lessons woven into mermaid lore also served practical purposes. For sailors and coastal communities, stories of mermaids carried warnings: do not give in to temptation, do not ignore the dangers of the sea, do not act without humility. Religious framing gave these lessons greater weight, embedding them into the spiritual life of societies. A story of a shipwreck caused by vanity or lust was more than entertainment. It became a parable, as instructive as any passage of scripture. Interestingly, some traditions even associated mermaids with divine feminine power. Their connection to fertility, motherhood, and the cycles of water made them symbols of creation as well as destruction. In certain strands of folklore, the mermaid was not only a warning but also a protector, a figure of abundance whose gifts could sustain life if properly respected. This dual role mirrors the ambivalent way many religions have understood the feminine divine, as a source of life but also a force to be feared if disrespected. By the Enlightenment, when rational thought began to challenge superstition, mermaids retained their moral symbolism even as belief in their literal existence waned. Writers used them in poetry and fables, allegorizing human weakness, the dangers of pride, or the fragility of faith. Artists painted them not only as mythical beings but as embodiments of the eternal struggle between flesh and spirit, desire and virtue. In this way, mermaids outlived the old world of superstition, adapting to new intellectual climates while retaining their role as moral teachers. What emerges across all these variations is a profound truth: mermaids were never just about the sea. They were about us, our choices, our temptations, our need for guidance. They symbolized what it meant to be human, pulled between beauty and danger, between fleeting desire and eternal consequence. Whether depicted as sinners, saints, goddesses, or demons, mermaids reflected the moral universe of their storytellers, carrying timeless lessons wrapped in the mystery of the ocean. And so, when we hear of sailors lured to their doom by a siren's song, or of fishermen who offered prayers to a water goddess, or of a child warned not to stray too far from shore lest a mermaid drag them down, we are hearing more than stories. We are hearing the voice of religion and morality speaking through myth, reminding us of humility, respect, and the fragile line between survival and destruction. In the end, the mermaid is not only a creature of the deep but also a messenger, one who speaks of faith, discipline, reverence, and the eternal human struggle to live rightly in a world of temptations. The Age of Exploration was a time when the oceans, once thought endless and unknowable, were mapped, crossed, and conquered by men driven by greed, faith, and wonder. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, ships set out from Europe with sails stretched high, their wooden hulls creaking against waves as they ventured into seas where no map could guide them. Yet even as cartographers drew new coastlines and claimed new territories, the deep remained a place of mystery. And in that mystery, the figure of the mermaid thrived. For in the journals of explorers and the whispers of sailors, sightings of mermaids were not just stories, they were recorded as events, real enough to be logged alongside weather reports and navigational notes. For sailors, long voyages were a trial of endurance. The horizon was endless, the nights cold, and the months away from land brutal. Hunger, thirst, and disease were constant companions. In such conditions, the imagination easily slipped between fact and fantasy. Shadows in the water could become monsters, the flash of a seal's tail might transform into the curve of a woman's body. But for men of that era, raised on folklore and guided by both superstition and faith, these visions were not dismissed as tricks of the eye. They were confirmations of what they already believed, that the seas were inhabited by beings beyond human understanding. One of the most famous reports comes from Christopher Columbus himself. In 1493, while sailing near the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic, Columbus claimed to have seen 3 mermaids rise from the sea. He wrote that they were not as beautiful as in popular tales but rather had some masculine traits. Modern scholars believe he may have mistaken manatees for mermaids. Yet the fact that he recorded them at all is telling. In an age where every sighting mattered, where explorers brought home tales of gold, strange animals, and foreign peoples, to write of mermaids was to affirm that they were part of the real, observable world. Other explorers followed suit. Henry Hudson, the English navigator famed for seeking the Northwest Passage, reported in 1608 that his crew had encountered a mermaid. She was described as having a woman's head and torso, with long black hair, but a fish's tail instead of legs. Hudson's logbook recorded the sight with the same matter-of-fact tone he used for icebergs and storm clouds. For him and his men, the mermaid was not fantasy but experience. These reports gave credibility to what sailors had whispered for generations, feeding both belief and fear. The spread of such tales during the Age of Exploration also reveals how folklore traveled alongside imperial ambition. As ships carried spices, silver, and slaves across oceans, they also carried stories. A mermaid sighted in the Caribbean could be compared with tales of water spirits in Africa or Asia, weaving together a global tapestry of myth. The oceans, rather than dividing cultures, became channels through which legends merged and multiplied. To a Portuguese sailor hearing of Memi Wata on the West African coast, the figure might not have seemed so different from the sirens described in his own homeland. To a Spanish explorer learning of Japan's Ninjo, the strangeness of the creature might only deepen his conviction that mermaids were everywhere. Mermaid sightings were also colored by the deep uncertainty of the era. The seas were not only physically dangerous but morally ambiguous. Crossing them was framed as both conquest and pilgrimage. The mermaid, appearing suddenly beside a ship, symbolized this tension. Was she a lure, tempting men to destruction, or a messenger, offering guidance? Some logs describe mermaids as omens of storm or disaster, while others saw their presence as a sign of fortune. Either way, they were woven into the rhythm of exploration, as much a part of the voyage as stars, tides, and winds. We must remember, too, that the men who wrote these accounts were steeped in a world where science had not yet fully separated from myth. Natural philosophy, religion, and folklore were all threads in the same tapestry. To describe a mermaid was not necessarily to contradict reason, it was to expand the boundaries of what reason might include. If the world was larger than anyone had imagined, then why should it not also contain creatures half human and half fish? For explorers confronting new lands, unfamiliar peoples, and animals unlike any seen in Europe, the mermaid was simply another marvel in a world overflowing with wonders. Yet the persistence of mermaid reports also reveals a psychological truth. These men were often starved of female company for months or years. Isolated on ships where discipline was harsh and danger constant, their minds longed for comfort, beauty, and companionship. The sea itself became feminized in their imaginations, unpredictable, alluring, nurturing, and destructive. To see a mermaid rising from the waves was to project desire and fear onto the very element that held their lives in its hands. The mermaid was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of their journey, a mixture of longing and danger, of hope and dread. As exploration expanded, so too did efforts to categorize the mermaid scientifically. Cabinets of curiosity, popular among wealthy Europeans, displayed alleged mermaid remains. Some were crude hoaxes, monkeys stitched onto fish tails, dried and presented as exotic specimens. But they were not dismissed as easily as we might imagine today. Instead, they sparked debate. Could it be that explorers were bringing back proof of creatures once thought mythical? For every skeptic, there were believers who pointed to the logs of Columbus and Hudson as evidence. After all, if such men could chart the coasts of new continents, why should their word about mermaids not also carry weight? The age of exploration, then, was a paradox. It was an era of maps and measurements, but also of dreams and fears. It gave us the beginnings of modern science but also preserved the most ancient of myths. The mermaid lived at the intersection of these worlds, at once a creature of legend and a presence recorded by navigators. In their eyes, to cross the sea was to risk meeting the unknown in its most human form, a being both like and unlike themselves, reflecting their desires, their doubts, and their destiny. And so, when we read of Columbus watching the waters for signs of land and seeing mermaids instead, or of Hudson's sailors whispering about the woman of the waves, we glimpse more than superstition. We glimpse the heart of an age when the world was opening, when the line between myth and reality was thin, and when every ripple on the ocean's surface seemed to carry a story worth telling. The mermaid was not simply a fantasy in these years, she was a fellow traveler, accompanying humanity as it stepped boldly into the vast unknown. The Age of Enlightenment dawned in the 17th and 18th centuries, and with it came a profound shift in the way humanity viewed the world. Reason, observation, and experimentation began to eclipse superstition and tradition. Natural philosophers, who would later be called scientists, sought to explain phenomena not with myth but with measurement. It was an age of microscopes, telescopes, and encyclopedias. Yet even as rational thought expanded, mermaids lingered in the cultural imagination. Their presence in this new intellectual climate reveals both the persistence of myth and the hunger for truth. For centuries, mermaids had been accepted as part of the natural order. Sailors saw them, explorers logged them, and priests used them as symbols in sermons. But Enlightenment thinkers began to ask sharper questions. What, precisely, was being seen? Could a creature half human and half fish exist according to natural law? If not, what accounted for the widespread belief in such beings? These questions turned the mermaid from a figure of unquestioned law into a subject of skeptical inquiry. Reports of mermaid sightings did not disappear during this period. On the contrary, sailors continued to describe encounters in the Caribbean, the Arctic, and the Indian Ocean. Merchants brought back preserved specimens, often grotesque composites stitched together by clever artisans, monkeys with fish tails, or papier-mâché forms dried to look like sea creatures. These objects appeared in cabinets of curiosity, private collections where wealthy patrons displayed wonders of nature alongside artifacts of myth. Visitors marveled, debated, and speculated. Was this evidence of a new species? Or was it an elaborate trick designed to captivate the imagination and empty purses? One of the most famous examples was the so-called Fiji mermaid, which appeared in the 19th century but drew upon practices established during the Enlightenment. It was a dried creature with the torso of a monkey and the lower body of a fish, displayed by showmen as proof of mermaid existence. Even when skeptics suspected fraud, the fascination was undeniable. For many, the possibility of such beings was not easily dismissed. After all, explorers had returned with kangaroos, platypuses, and narwhal tusks, animals so strange they seemed like fables come to life. If these were real, why not mermaids? The Enlightenment's great encyclopedias reflected this tension between skepticism and belief. Some volumes catalogued mermaids alongside known marine creatures, cautiously noting that while no reliable evidence had been confirmed, reports from credible sources could not be entirely ignored. Others dismissed them outright, labeling them as imaginary beings that revealed more about human psychology than about the ocean. The very act of debating them marked a turning point. Mermaids had moved from unquestioned myth into the realm of contested possibility. Scientific curiosity drove attempts to explain mermaid sightings in naturalistic terms. Manatees and dugongs, with their rounded bodies, slow movements, and habit of lifting their heads from the water to breathe, were frequently cited as the creatures mistaken for mermaids. Sailors long at sea, their eyes strained and their minds filled with longing, might have seen what they wished rather than what was truly there. This theory, first suggested during the Enlightenment, remains the most accepted explanation today. Yet for those living in the 18th century, the line between misidentification and miracle was not so clear. The sea, after all, still held vast uncharted mysteries. But skepticism was growing. Natural philosophers such as Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, sought to classify all life forms with precision. His Systema Naturae, published in 1735, was a monumental attempt to organize the natural world. In earlier drafts, he left space for mythological creatures, acknowledging reports of satyrs, unicorns, and mermaids. Yet as his work developed, he increasingly excluded such beings, reflecting the Enlightenment's shift toward empirical evidence. To be considered real, a creature had to be observed, measured, and dissected. Mermaids, lacking proof, were pushed to the margins of scientific respectability. Still, the fascination endured. The Enlightenment was not only an age of reason but also an age of wonder. Curiosity cabinets gave way to museums, where mermaid specimens, fraudulent or not, drew crowds. Artists continued to paint mermaids, blending myth with the aesthetics of neoclassicism. Writers, too, used mermaids as metaphors for the tension between illusion and reality, between passion and reason. In a sense, the mermaid became a mirror for the Enlightenment itself, a reminder that even in an age of logic, the human heart still yearned for mystery. It is striking how many Enlightenment thinkers approached the mermaid with a combination of skepticism and empathy. They did not merely laugh at sailors' tales. Instead, they asked why so many intelligent men had believed what they saw. The answer often lay in the conditions of sea travel, hunger, fatigue, longing, and the play of light on the waves. In studying mermaid myths, Enlightenment scholars began, perhaps unknowingly, to study human perception itself. They moved from asking, "Do mermaids exist?" to asking, "Why do we believe in them?" This subtle shift marked the beginning of modern psychology, where the mind's illusions were considered as worthy of study as the external world. Mermaid lore also intersected with debates about religion. In earlier centuries, mermaids had been symbols of sin or redemption, woven into sermons as moral lessons. But Enlightenment thinkers, increasingly skeptical of supernatural claims, reinterpreted these symbols as cultural artifacts. A mermaid was no longer evidence of the devil's temptation but rather a projection of human desire and fear. In this way, mythology was secularized, studied as part of humanity's cultural heritage rather than as divine truth. Despite skepticism, the allure of mermaids proved enduring because they embodied what the Enlightenment could not entirely dispel: the unknown. Even as telescopes revealed distant planets and microscopes unveiled tiny organisms, the oceans remained vast and unfathomable. What lay beneath their surface was still largely hidden. In that darkness, the mermaid remained a possibility, a figure poised between science and imagination. To dismiss her entirely was to deny the sense of wonder that fueled exploration itself. Thus, the Enlightenment did not kill the mermaid. It transformed her. No longer a certainty, she became a question. No longer a moral symbol alone, she became a subject of scientific curiosity. No longer a universal belief, she became a contested mystery, one that revealed as much about the human search for truth as about the sea itself. If the Enlightenment placed the mermaid under the lens of skepticism, the world of literature and art ensured she would never vanish from imagination. While scientists and philosophers debated her existence, poets, painters, and storytellers gave her life in forms more enduring than flesh. Through ink and canvas, through rhyme and song, the mermaid became immortal. She was no longer only a figure lurking in the waves, she was a muse, a metaphor, and a mirror of the human condition. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and 19th centuries was especially fertile ground for mermaids. In reaction to the rationalism of the Enlightenment, Romantics turned toward mystery, emotion, and the sublime. They sought beauty in ruins, majesty in storms, and meaning in myths. For them, the mermaid embodied the essence of longing, half human, half otherworldly, forever caught between two realms. Writers such as Lord Alfred Tennyson, John Keats, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge drew inspiration from the sea, filling their verses with spectral figures, seductive sirens, and oceanic mysteries. The mermaid, graceful yet tragic, became a recurring symbol of unattainable desire and the dangers of passion. Perhaps the most enduring literary contribution came from Hans Christian Andersen in 1837 with The Little Mermaid. His tale was unlike the sailor's reports or medieval warnings. Instead, Andersen gave the mermaid a soul, a voice, and a tragedy. His heroine longed not to destroy sailors but to transcend her own limitations. She wished for love, humanity, and immortality of spirit. The story, filled with longing and sacrifice, was both heartbreaking and redemptive. It presented the mermaid not as a symbol of sin but as an emblem of human yearning for connection and transcendence. Andersen's mermaid does not achieve earthly happiness, but she finds eternal meaning, turning the story into a parable about love, loss, and the spiritual value of sacrifice. This shift was significant. No longer was the mermaid merely an external threat to men, she became the protagonist of her own story. Through Andersen, she embodied the struggles of identity, transformation, and the painful costs of desire. His tale echoed through generations, shaping how countless readers would come to view the mermaid, not as a monster, but as a tragic heroine torn between worlds. Art of the 19th century echoed these themes. Painters of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, such as John William Waterhouse and Edward Burne-Jones, depicted mermaids in lush, melancholic tones. Their canvases showed pale women with flowing hair gazing into mirrors or reaching longingly toward the shore. These works blended beauty with sorrow, capturing the mermaid as a figure of both enchantment and melancholy. In Waterhouse's paintings especially, the mermaid is caught in introspection, comb in hand, symbolizing not vanity but self-awareness, as though she herself understood the duality of her existence. Elsewhere in visual art, mermaids were painted not as tragic but as dangerous. Gustave Dorés engravings and later symbolist artists portrayed them as seductresses pulling men beneath the waves, their beauty a fatal trap. Here, the older medieval motif of temptation endured, reinterpreted through a lens of romantic danger. Whether tragic or deadly, the mermaid was irresistible to artists seeking to capture the deep currents of human emotion. Literature of the 19th century continued to expand on these themes. Poets such as Matthew Arnold and Alfred Lord Tennyson evoked mermaids as voices of the sea, eternal singers whose songs echoed the grief and beauty of nature itself. In Arnold's The Forsaken Merman, a human woman abandons her sea-dwelling lover, leaving him and their children to mourn her absence forever. The poem captures the pain of divided worlds, the sorrow of love's sacrifice to duty. Again and again, the mermaid became a symbol for impossible unions, for the ache of longing that could never be resolved. As the Victorian era progressed, mermaids also entered popular culture more broadly. They appeared in children's storybooks, stage performances, and even advertisements, often softened into whimsical figures rather than dangerous ones. Yet even in these gentler portrayals, their core themes persisted: beauty, mystery, and longing. The Victorian fascination with the supernatural made mermaids part of a wider trend that included fairies, ghosts, and spirits, beings that blurred the line between real and imagined, between this world and another. In the 20th century, mermaids took on new artistic lives. Early cinema embraced them as figures of fantasy. Silent films depicted mermaids in shimmering costumes, emerging from painted waves, embodying both innocence and spectacle. In later decades, animated adaptations, most famously Disney's The Little Mermaid in 1989, brought Anderson's tale to new audiences. While Disney softened the tragic ending into one of hope and joy, the essence of longing and transformation remained central. Ariel's voice, traded for legs, symbolized the cost of desire, even in a story reimagined for modern children. The popularity of this adaptation ensured that mermaids would remain embedded in global consciousness, loved by millions across generations. In modern literature, mermaids have been reinterpreted through diverse lenses. Some works embrace feminist readings, portraying mermaids as symbols of female autonomy and suppressed desire. Others reclaim darker versions, emphasizing their role as predators or avengers of the sea. Fantasy novels and films frequently use mermaids to explore the tension between freedom and captivity, between self and society. In all these forms, the mermaid continues to be more than a myth. She is a metaphor for the human condition, endlessly adaptable to the questions of each age. Art, too, has not let her go. Contemporary painters, photographers, and sculptors revisit the mermaid as a figure of ecological warning, tying her fate to the endangered oceans themselves. In these works, the mermaid becomes a voice for nature, a reminder that humanity's treatment of the sea has consequences. The same creature who once lured sailors to their doom now asks humanity to reconsider its relationship with the waters that sustain life. What makes mermaids so enduring in literature and art is their duality. They are both human and other, both alluring and terrifying, both tragic and powerful. This tension allows each generation to reshape them to fit its own fears, desires, and dreams. Where medieval sermons saw sin, Anderson saw longing. Where romantic painters saw melancholy, Disney saw innocence and hope. Where modern artists see ecological crisis, others still see eternal mystery. The mermaid changes, yet she remains. In the end, mermaids in literature and art remind us of the power of storytelling. They show us how myths evolve, how symbols adapt, and how imagination can keep alive what reason sets aside. A sailor's sighting may fade, a scientist's skepticism may prevail, but a poem, a painting, or a story can preserve a mermaid forever. She swims not only in the sea but in ink and paint, in melody and image, in every dream shaped by human creativity. And so, when you close your eyes and imagine a mermaid, whether she is Anderson's tragic heroine, Waterhouse's reflective beauty, or Disney's bright and hopeful Ariel, you are part of a lineage stretching back centuries. You are witnessing how myth, art, and story carry forward what the waves themselves may never reveal. The mermaid, eternal muse of longing and mystery, continues to live not in the ocean alone, but in the boundless seas of human imagination. The Age of Reason, also known as the Enlightenment, marked a profound transformation in the way humans viewed the world, their place in it, and the stories that had once shaped entire civilizations. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the tide of intellectual thought had shifted dramatically. Where once fear and awe of the sea had produced stories of mermaids luring sailors to their deaths, now a rising chorus of philosophers, scientists, and explorers began to unravel those beliefs with cold logic and evidence. Yet the decline of mermaid lore was not abrupt, nor was it absolute. It was, instead, a slow and layered unraveling, a gradual erosion of myth by the currents of reason, though traces of enchantment continued to cling stubbornly to the imagination. In earlier centuries, tales of mermaids had been regarded as both warnings and sacred truths. They explained the unexplainable, the wreck of a ship, the sudden disappearance of a fisherman, the eerie music heard across the waves on moonlit nights. But as the Enlightenment took hold, men and women began to demand explanations rooted in nature rather than in legend. Thinkers like René Descartes and Francis Bacon emphasized observation, rationality, and method. What once had been whispered as evidence of the supernatural was now brought under the scrutiny of natural philosophy. The ocean, that dark and unknowable expanse, began to be measured, charted, and explored. Yet this shift did not erase mermaids entirely. For every skeptic who declared that sightings were likely seals, manatees, or dugongs glimpsed in poor light, there were still sailors who swore by their encounters. Reports continued to circulate, often colored with urgency, as if men could not yet bear to let go of such alluring mysteries. Ship logs and travel diaries from the 17th and 18th centuries still make mention of mermaid encounters, though increasingly these were met with skepticism rather than reverence. A once sacred tale became, slowly, an oddity to be explained rather than a danger to be feared. The decline of belief was aided by voyages of discovery. As European ships traveled further than ever before, across the coasts of Africa, into the Caribbean, across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, sailors encountered sea creatures unfamiliar to European eyes. Manatees grazing near the surface, dugongs rising with their strange, human-like eyes, and seals sunbathing on rocks offered very plausible sources for the old legends. Naturalists began to sketch these animals and publish their descriptions, showing them as they truly were. These records chipped away at the enchantment of the mermaid. No longer was she an ethereal being of otherworldly beauty, but instead, perhaps, just a marine mammal misunderstood by weary men at sea. At the same time, the intellectual climate of the Enlightenment was reshaping attitudes toward myth itself. The very purpose of stories was questioned. Were legends like those of mermaids meant to describe literal truths, or were they allegories reflecting the hopes, fears, and desires of humanity? Philosophers argued that myths revealed more about human psychology and culture than about physical reality. A mermaid, they suggested, was less a creature lurking in the deep and more a symbol of temptation, of the unknown, of humankind's uneasy relationship with the sea. This was a profound shift. Where once legends were taken at face value, they were now dissected as metaphors. But this dissection came at a cost. The emotional potency of the mermaid myth began to fade. For the common sailor, there was still room for awe and wonder. For the growing educated classes in Europe, however, such beliefs became associated with ignorance and superstition. Pamphlets mocked those who still clung to stories of sea maidens, lumping them together with tales of witches, trolls, and dragons. By the late 18th century, to believe in mermaids was, in certain circles, to risk ridicule. What had once inspired reverence now inspired skepticism, or worse, laughter. Yet even as belief declined, fascination endured. This is the paradox of the Enlightenment's relationship with myth. Humans may stop believing, but they rarely stop imagining. The mermaid remained captivating, but increasingly she lived in art and literature rather than in the daily fears of seafarers. Painters depicted her in oils, draped in shimmering scales, often embodying ideals of beauty or peril. Writers used her as a symbol in poems and stories, where she represented mystery, danger, or unattainable desire. What had once been a literal warning about shipwrecks became, instead, a metaphorical exploration of human longing. The decline of mermaid belief was not universal, of course. In coastal villages where fishing remained perilous, older superstitions lingered. Grandmothers still told stories of sea women who could bless or curse the catch. Sailors on long voyages still whispered of strange creatures glimpsed in the night. But in the growing urban centers of Europe, with their coffee houses, scientific societies, and expanding libraries, such stories were increasingly relegated to the realm of folklore rather than fact. This decline in literal belief also reveals something larger about the human journey. As science advanced, myths lost their authority, but they did not vanish. Instead, they transformed. Mermaids did not disappear, they shifted into new cultural forms. They became part of the folklore that anthropologists would later study, part of the literature that romantics would later romanticize, part of the art that would decorate salons and galleries. Their essence endured, even as their status changed. In many ways, this process mirrored humanity's broader relationship with mystery. Each age of discovery replaced one set of questions with another. The Enlightenment stripped away mermaids but opened new puzzles: the deep currents of the sea, the lives of marine animals, the mechanisms of tides and storms. In gaining knowledge, humanity also lost a measure of enchantment. The sea was no longer haunted by sirens; it was a place to be mapped, studied, and exploited. Yet the longing for wonder never vanished entirely. Thus, the decline of mermaid belief in the Age of Reason was not a death but a transformation. It marked the end of an age where the ocean was seen as a stage for divine and monstrous beings, and the beginning of an age where it was understood through charts and telescopes. And yet, even in this age of logic, the mermaid remained a powerful presence, not as a literal threat, but as an enduring symbol of the unknown. The Enlightenment may have banished her from the sea, but it could not banish her from the imagination. That is why, centuries later, we still whisper her name, paint her likeness, and wonder what it might mean if, just beyond the reach of reason, there still swam a creature half human, half sea, reminding us that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. The decline of literal belief in mermaids during the Enlightenment did not bring their story to an end. On the contrary, the myth underwent a metamorphosis, shedding its place as a seafaring superstition and re-emerging as a powerful cultural symbol in modern myth and media. In literature, art, theater, and eventually film, the mermaid lived on, transformed, reinterpreted, and given new layers of meaning. From romantic poetry to Disney animations, she became less a feared omen of shipwreck and more a figure of longing, beauty, danger, and transformation. This survival across centuries proves that while reason may strip away belief, imagination always finds a way to keep myth alive. The Romantic era of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was perhaps the first cultural revival of the mermaid myth after its decline. Romantic poets and painters, dissatisfied with the cold rationality of the Enlightenment, sought out wonder, mystery, and emotional intensity. The mermaid became a symbol of all three. Writers depicted her not as a literal sea creature but as a figure of desire and unattainable beauty, often representing the eternal tension between human yearning and natural power. She was no longer just a warning against maritime danger but a muse, a haunting reminder of what lies beyond reach. Romantic painters captured her reclining on rocks, her flowing hair tangled with seaweed, her eyes both alluring and melancholy. The sea maiden thus became a symbol of passion, peril, and loss. The 19th century also gave rise to one of the most enduring mermaid tales in literature, Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, first published in 1837. Unlike earlier myths that emphasized danger and destruction, Andersen's tale was deeply human in its emotional scope. His mermaid was not a monstrous temptress but a tragic heroine, willing to sacrifice everything, her voice, her world, her very life, for love and the possibility of an immortal soul. Andersen's tale was both enchanting and heartbreaking, embodying themes of longing, sacrifice, and the costs of transformation. Unlike the old myths where sailors perished at the hands of mermaids, this story presented the mermaid herself as the one who suffered, caught between two worlds and belonging fully to neither. This inversion marked a powerful turning point. Mermaids were no longer villains but complex beings embodying the bittersweet struggles of human existence. Andersen's Mermaid became the prototype for countless later interpretations. In the Victorian era, she appeared in illustrations, operas, and stage plays. Artists and writers found in her an ideal metaphor for the tension between desire and duty, passion and morality, freedom and restraint. To Victorians wrestling with strict social codes, the figure of a woman who longed for another world but was punished for her yearning resonated deeply. The mermaid thus became an enduring cultural symbol not only of the sea but of human longing itself. As the 20th century dawned, the mermaid myth evolved again, this time through the medium of mass entertainment. She was brought into the world of cinema, first in silent films and later in technicolor spectacles. Early portrayals often emphasized spectacle and exoticism, presenting mermaids as glamorous, mysterious, and somewhat fantastical beings. By mid-century, however, The mermaid's image had shifted once more, softened by popular culture into a figure of enchantment suitable for children as well as adults. The most famous modern reinterpretation came in 1989 with Disney's animated film The Little Mermaid. Drawing inspiration from Andersen's tale but reworking it into a more hopeful and romantic narrative, the film introduced Ariel, a curious and rebellious young mermaid who longs to explore the human world. Unlike Andersen's tragic heroine, Ariel is rewarded with love and transformation rather than punished. Disney's retelling popularized the mermaid myth for new generations, imprinting her image on the global imagination. Ariel's red hair, bright eyes, and adventurous spirit became iconic, cementing the mermaid not as a figure of doom but as a beloved protagonist in popular culture. This transformation reveals how adaptable myths are. In the medieval world, mermaids reflected fear of the sea, of temptation, of female power. In the Romantic era, they became symbols of longing and unattainable beauty. In modern mass media, they shifted again, embodying youthful curiosity, independence, and optimism. The myth never died, it simply changed costume to match the needs and desires of each new age. Yet modern portrayals are not entirely without darkness. In literature, art, and even some films, the dangerous allure of the mermaid persists. Fantasy novels often revisit her as a siren figure, capable of luring men to watery graves. Contemporary horror films sometimes reimagine her as a predator, her beauty masking lethal intent. This duality, between the innocent, playful mermaid of children's stories and the deadly siren of darker retellings, shows that the myth continues to thrive in many forms, never bound to just one interpretation. In addition to entertainment, mermaids have become powerful symbols in other realms of modern life. They appear in logos, brands, and mascots, from coffee shops to seaside towns, signifying mystery, allure, and maritime identity. They are celebrated in festivals, parades, and cosplay events around the world. Communities by the sea embrace the mermaid as both a cultural heritage figure and a modern emblem of beauty and resilience. Even as belief in her literal existence has vanished, she remains a living, breathing part of collective imagination and cultural identity. Furthermore, mermaids have become central figures in feminist reinterpretations of myth. Writers and artists have recast them as symbols of female agency, reclaiming narratives that once demonized them as dangerous seductresses. Instead of seeing mermaids as warnings against female power, modern feminists interpret them as emblems of independence, rebellion, and the struggle to find one's voice. Andersen's tale of a mermaid silenced for love resonates particularly strongly in this context. Her sacrifice of her voice becomes a metaphor for the silencing of women, and her longing for freedom reflects the broader struggles for equality. In this way, mermaids continue to speak to modern audiences, embodying themes far removed from their medieval origins yet still rooted in the timeless human condition. Technology, too, has breathed new life into the myth. Digital art, fantasy video games, and streaming television series have reimagined mermaids in stunning, varied forms. Sometimes they are whimsical and magical, sometimes terrifying and otherworldly. In all cases, they remain compelling. Even in a world that has mapped the oceans and studied its creatures, we continue to imagine that just beneath the waves, something human yet not quite human still lingers. The mermaid's appeal endures because she represents that liminal space, between the known and the unknown, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Perhaps this is why mermaids have proven so resilient across centuries. They are not merely characters in old legends, they are mirrors of ourselves. They embody longing, transformation, danger, beauty, and the enduring mystery of the sea. From shipwreck legends to Disney princesses, from dark sirens to feminist icons, the mermaid adapts because she reflects what we most need her to be in each age. She is at once ancient and modern, terrifying and enchanting, tragic and triumphant. As modern media continues to evolve, the mermaid story will likely continue to shift. She may be reimagined in new cultural contexts, given fresh symbolism, or repurposed to reflect the anxieties and dreams of the future. But one thing is certain, the mermaid will not vanish. Her form may change, but her presence will remain as eternal as the sea itself. In the end, she endures not because people believe in her literal existence, but because she captures something far deeper, our endless need for stories that bridge the divide between the world we know and the mysteries we yearn to touch.